What would you do if someone looked at a contract you signed, pointed to a line buried somewhere in the fine print, and walked out the door with your entire company? Not a hostile takeover, not a lawsuit, just a quiet legal theft that left you sitting in a train car with nothing but a sketch pad and the slowly dawning realization that you'd handed them everything. That's what happened to Walt Disney in 1928. He was 26 years old, and the character he'd spent 2 years building, the one that was finally making him money, belonged to someone else. And instead of giving up, he got on a train, drew a mouse, and started over. Again. Walt Disney was born in 1901 in Chicago, and he grew up on a farm in Missouri under a father named Elias, who had absolutely zero interest in creativity, art, or anything that couldn't be weighed or harvested. Elias ran his household like a foreman runs a work crew, and Walt delivered newspapers at 3:30 in the morning before school. No payment, just expectation. What Elias never figured out was that his youngest son was spending every available minute drawing obsessively, filling pages with characters and faces and animals that had no practical use whatsoever. Walt Disney was not built for farm life, and the farm knew it. By his early 20s, Walt had moved to Kansas City and figured out that the animation business operated on a simple and deeply unfair principle. Studios owned everything, distributors owned the studios, and the people who actually created things owned nothing. He started his first company anyway. Laugh-O-Gram Studios launched in 1922, producing animated fairy tales that people genuinely enjoyed watching. Walt had talent, momentum, and a team that believed in him. What he didn't have was any margin for error financially, and when a distribution deal collapsed and the money dried up, so did everything else. Laugh-O-Gram went bankrupt in 1923. Walt was 21, broke, and sleeping in his office because he couldn't afford rent. He was eating beans cold out of the can. Life is simple, and simple is terrible. Most people would have quit. Most people would have moved back home or found some stable job that didn't require them to reinvent themselves before they turned 25. Walt Disney instead treated failure like tuition. He'd paid for an education in how the animation business actually worked, who controlled what, where the real money went, which partnerships could be trusted and which couldn't. Every bankruptcy taught him something the successful people in the room had never needed to learn. He scraped together $40 and bought a one-way train ticket to Los Angeles. His brother Roy was already out there, recovering from tuberculosis at a veterans hospital. Walt had no contacts on the West Coast, no reputation, and a cardboard suitcase that probably looked exactly as depressing as it sounds. He went to every major studio in Hollywood trying to get hired as a director. Every single one turned him down. So he and Roy pooled their money, set up a camera in their uncle's garage, and started what would become the Disney Brothers Cartoon Studio. By 1927, Walt had created a character called Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. The shorts were doing well, and Walt flew to New York feeling like he'd finally figured it out. He was going to negotiate a better deal. He was going to get what he was worth. Instead, his distributor informed him politely that Oswald belonged to them. It was in the contract. They were also keeping most of his animation team, who'd been quietly offered better money on the side. Walt Disney boarded a train back to Los Angeles with literally nothing. Again. Which, honestly, at this point, I'd have just become a farmer. The betrayal was total and absolute. The man Walt had trusted had legally dismantled everything he'd built, and there was nothing illegal about any of it. But sitting in that rail car with nothing but a pencil and paper, Walt made a decision that would define everything that came after. He would never again build something that could be taken from him by a contract. Somewhere on that train ride between betrayal and rock bottom, he drew a mouse. He called him Mortimer, which his wife Lillian correctly identified as a deeply terrible name for a cartoon character, and suggested Mickey instead. Mickey Mouse debuted in November 1928 in Steamboat Willie, the first animated film to use synchronized sound. Audiences had never experienced anything like it, and this time, Walt had structured everything to make sure the character was legally, completely, irrevocably his. He'd learned the Oswald lesson in the worst possible way, and he wasn't going to repeat it. Through the early 1930s, Mickey made Walt Disney the most respected name in animation, and Walt started pushing his team towards something that everybody in Hollywood thought was an absolutely deranged idea. He wanted to make a feature-length animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The press called it Disney's folly. Nobody had ever produced a full-length animated feature before, and the consensus was that it would cost a fortune, take years, and bore audiences to the point of mutiny. The production ran so far over budget that Walt mortgaged his house to get the money to finish it. Snow White opened in December 1937 and became the highest-grossing film of 1938. Walt watched the audience stand up and applaud at the end of the first screening. He'd just proved something nobody believed was possible, which, given his track record, was basically Tuesday. Then came Pinocchio and Fantasia. Both lost serious money. The studio nearly collapsed in 1940, and then again in 1941, and the thing that ultimately kept it alive was a government contract during World War II to produce military training films and propaganda. Walt Disney spent part of the war making films about hygiene, aircraft recognition, and venereal disease. Not exactly the artistic legacy he had in mind, but it kept the lights on and the studio intact, which was the only thing that mattered. After the war, Walt started talking about a park, not a carnival, not a fairground, something different. A place where the worlds he'd been drawing for 30 years could exist physically, where you could walk around inside a story. Every bank he approached turned him down flat. The concept made no sense to anyone with a spreadsheet. Walt liquidated his life insurance policy to get initial funding, sold his vacation home, and made a deal with ABC Television. They would co-invest in exchange for a weekly Disney television program. Disneyland opened in Anaheim on July 17, 1955, and opening day was a complete disaster. Counterfeit tickets flooded the gates. The fresh asphalt was so soft that women's heels sank directly into it. Attractions broke down. Walt watched the chaos on live television from a camera tower. Within a few weeks, the park was printing money. What every bank had rejected without hesitation turned out to be the most profitable entertainment venture he'd ever built, and he'd built it on a leveraged life insurance policy and a television deal. Here's what most people miss about Disneyland. It wasn't just a theme park. It was the proof of concept for an entirely new financial model. Disney wasn't selling tickets. Disney was building real estate that happened to entertain people. The land, the infrastructure, the intellectual property embedded in every ride and character, all of it appreciated in value while simultaneously generating daily cash flow. Walt had figured out, almost accidentally, the same principle that would later make McDonald's one of the largest property companies on Earth. The attraction was the excuse. The land was the asset. By the early 1960s, the Disney Company was pulling revenue from films, television, merchandise, and the park simultaneously. Walt was also quietly buying thousands of acres of swamp in Central Florida through shell companies, specifically so nobody would figure out what he was doing and drive up the prices. He called it the Florida Project. He was building something that would make Disneyland look like a prototype. Walt Disney died of lung cancer on December 15, 1966. Not a single shovel of dirt had been turned on the Florida property. Walt Disney World opened in 1971 under Roy's direction and became the most visited theme park on Earth. Roy died 2 months later. The company they built is worth over $200 billion today. It owns ABC, ESPN, Pixar, Marvel, Lucasfilm, and 20th Century Studios. It operates theme parks on 5 continents. All of it traces back to a man who went bankrupt at 21, got legally robbed at 26, nearly lost his studio twice more, and kept drawing anyway. Every time the system took something from him, he built something the system couldn't touch. That mouse he drew on the train, the one his wife made him rename, turned out to be worth more than everything they ever tried to take from him. If this story hit you the way it hits most people, hit the like button and subscribe. Every week we open a new page in history's ledger, and trust me, the stories only get bigger from here.